You think fishing is peaceful. Wait until you hear these 3 true stories that will make you think twice before casting after dark. I've always loved being out on the water. Grew up on weekends with a rod in my hand, the smell of gasoline from an old motor, and an excuse to disappear into places where cell service thinned and the world slowed down. There's something honest about fishing. The quiet, the patience, the small rituals. Bait on the hook, the plink of a bobber, the slow turn of the line as you wait. That same quiet is why I and a lot of people I know keep going back to the same isolated spots, even when they feel a little off. It's where you can be alone with your thoughts, and sometimes where you stumble into things that don't make sense. These 3 stories are all true accounts from people I know, or people they knew. Different places, different nights. One thing in common: water, low light, small choices that became huge regrets in a matter of seconds. I'll tell them in the order they happened to the people who lived them. I'll give you the details, because the details are what make them stick with you. I'll also give you a few plausible explanations where they make sense, and then I'll leave the rest unresolved. That's how these stories felt to the people who were there. A door that clicked shut, but you never really saw what went by. The first one happened at a lake we'd been fishing since we were kids. We knew every rock, every drop of the shoreline, every hidden current. My brother JJ and I were there later than we should have been, because that's how it goes. You keep saying, one more cast, until the sky fades into the kind of dusk that makes the trees look like black cutouts. It was quiet in that way that feels like the world is holding its breath. The water lay flat, except for the occasional ring from a fish breaking the surface, and the soft slap of our boots against the old dock. We had a couple of lanterns on the bank, the kind that throw a warm circle of light and leave everything else in shadow. You could smell wood smoke from a distant cabin and the metallic tang of the water. The mosquitoes were bad that night, high-pitched whines against the skin, until you couldn't tell if the shivering you felt was from the bite or from something else. Then we saw ripples on the far side of the lake. Not the predictable ring of a jumping fish, but a slow line of disturbances, like something passing just underneath the skin of the water. At first we joked about beavers or a raccoon. Then the ripples resolved into a dark mass that rose out of the lake and sat up like a person. She surfaced maybe 30 yards away. She had long hair that hung in wet sheets, and at first, in that weird evening light, she looked almost like she belonged there. The way she held herself, slow, deliberate, not splashing, just moving through the water with this smooth, easy motion. The thing that lodged in my head later was how long she seemed to hold her breath. It wasn't a quick submerge and pop. She would slip below and stay under for an amount of time that felt wrong. One time, maybe 2, I could make sense of it, but she kept doing it, coming up calmer each time, then going under again, like a practiced swimmer who didn't need to breathe. She started to come closer, not fast, just the drip of water from her hair, the soft lap as her torso cleared the surface, a faint silver flash where the lamp hit the lake and caught something on her skin. Her face was almost expressionless, and she said something, a voice that carried over the quiet, thin and low. I can't recall the exact words now without sounding like I'm borrowing a horror movie line, but she said something that invited us. Not in panic, not like someone needing help. It was like an offer. Come in. Stay. Swim. JJ and I exchanged a look. You know that look between people who grew up sharing the same stupid dares and the same superstition. The kind that says, maybe we can test it. Maybe we can pull off one of those stories we tell ourselves around the bonfire. But there was also a real part of us that felt the first prick of danger, the hair on your arms tilting upright. We stayed on the bank. That was enough to make her smile, sort of. It was a small smile, almost teasing. Then, when we shook our heads and said no, she screamed. It wasn't a splash or a cry that fit in the night's texture. It was a long, jagged shriek that seemed to come from deeper than lungs, something that cut through the air and landed inside your chest. JJ went white. I have never heard anyone, at least not a person I knew, make a sound like that. It was the kind of scream you hear in nightmares, ragged and full of something raw and impossible to place. We both bolted. Our legs were rubber, every instinct telling us to move. We ran to the car, and I'm not proud to say we left behind bait, a tackle box, everything. The lake glistened behind us, serene as if nothing had happened. We called the police once we were a safe distance away. The operator sent an officer out. He walked the shore with us, flashlight beams cutting white arcs through the persistent dusk. We walked down the same dock, calling her name like you call for someone lost. The water showed nothing. No footprints, no swirls, nothing. We all went back the next morning with my dad, in a cooler, in the kind of hope that comes from thinking you'll find a rational explanation. Maybe somebody pulled a prank. Maybe some transient had slept in the reeds. But there were no signs, no belongings, no clothes, no campsite. The launch area was clean, the shoreline intact. It was as if a person had been there and then taken off into thin air. People offered theories. Maybe she was mentally ill and had wandered in from a nearby road. Maybe she was intoxicated or somehow sleepwalking. Maybe she was avoiding people.
Those things are possible. They're the kind of things our rational minds grab at to stop the spinning. But for all of those explanations, you have to account for the breath-holding, for the way she resurfaced as though she'd been practicing how not to breathe, and for that scream, a sound that felt too enormous to be made by someone you could have simply talked down. In the weeks that followed, JJ and I found ourselves going back to that lake at odd times. Not to fish, not really, but because the story lodged in us like a burr we couldn't shake. Sometimes we'd park and listen to the night like it could tell us what had happened. Sometimes we'd sit and try to map every shadow and light to make sense of it. People on the internet, names I don't remember, speculated about lake spirits and drowned women. I don't believe in the phrase definitely supernatural, and I won't say that's what it was. I will say this: the way she moved, the scream, the fact that she was there and then not, those elements put a kind of weight into the memory that nothing tidy could fully explain. If you've ever had something weird happen while fishing, anything that made you bolt or hang your breath in your throat, tell me in the comments. I want to know which of these hits you hardest. After that night, you start to notice the small differences, the way water can smooth things out and hide other things, the way darkness makes familiar places feel foreign. Which brings me to the second story, and it's the one that stuck with me because it was brutal in a tactile, animal way. Jay and Angel were both experienced with the marshes around their town. They fished by kayak, which is a different kind of solitude. You're closer to the waterline, your feet nearer to the muck, the reeds brushing your shoulders. On the day this happened, it was an overcast afternoon that had the marsh smelling like wet paper and algae. The water tasted like iron when it sloshed over the rim of the kayak during sudden little waves. They were laughing and comparing rigs when Angel dropped his phone. It slipped off the seat and plunked quietly into the black water, sinking with that subtle, guilty silence phones make when they go into places they shouldn't. Angel didn't hesitate. He clambered out, rolled his pants up, and waded into the marsh. In those shallow places, the water looks shallow until it clutches at your boots and the mud sucks. He was careful at first, feeling with his hands through the soft sludge, not going in deeper than his knees. Jay stayed in the kayak, a kind of nervous anchor, calling out suggestions. And then something grabbed Angel. It wasn't like a sudden swipe from a snapping turtle, or the smooth, predictable tug of a bass. Jay described it as a firm, uncompromising force that wrapped around Angel's ankle for a moment and tried to pull him under. He didn't see fingers. He just saw the water erupt and the reeds bend, as if something large had taken him by surprise.
Angel's body dipped. Water closed over his head. For a second, everything was just frantic motion and the brutal silence of being submerged. When Angel came up, he was coated in thick globs of black marsh muck. His face alone broke the surface, like a survivor popping from a different world. He was coughing and shaking, the kind of shaking that isn't from the cold, but from adrenaline and the deep-rooted animal panic of having been held under. He screamed in the way people scream when they think they're not going to make it, a single sound that candies every possibility of what might have happened. They escaped. Jay pushed the kayak back to shore with both hands until it scraped. Angel stumbled, knee-deep in the wet for a while, looking down at the area where the water had closed over him, as if the place itself had teeth. He kept saying, "It wasn't a fish." He said it over and over, as if repeating the phrase could anchor it to something sensible. His hands were raw from grabbing at the muck. Later, even after they were a block and a half from the marsh, his skin kept trembling. There are a bunch of plausible things here, too. Marshes have old cables, leftover ropes from abandoned hunting blinds, snagged nets that can loop around an ankle and yank. There are eels, large snapping turtles, and submerged branches that can cause a terrible, panicked feeling. But Jay and Angel both swore what grabbed him didn't feel like an ordinary snag. Jay said he could see the way Angel's pant leg puffed out and then flattened, as if whatever pulled had a rounded, compressive pressure, not a sharp hooking. We talk about things with names because names make fear tolerable. It was a rope, it was a fish, it was someone reaching. But sometimes you don't get that comfort. Sometimes you get a force you can't explain, and the only honest thing to do is to acknowledge you don't know what grabbed Angel's ankle beneath that murky water. He stopped sleeping well for months. He stopped paddling into shallow reeds. Even now, when he drives by that march on the road, he slows down and stares like the place can still reach out. There's a detail that won't leave me. When Angel came up, there was a small smear on his calf. Not blood, just a dark streak, like the imprint of something that had been coated in ooze. He said the muck smelled like old pennies, like iron and rot. That kind of sensory memory is hard to argue away. Facts can sit beside feelings, and in the end, both exist. The marsh teaches you to respect the quiet. It's patient. It hides things until you reward it with an arm or a leg. That pattern of still water, hidden force, slow realization set a tone that runs into the third story. The last one is the one that feels the most like a classic campfire tale, until you remember the people involved are real and shaken. This happened at a reservoir a few hours' drive from my hometown.
The reservoir was off limits past certain hours. The kind of place with no trespassing signs you nod at and then creep past because you want a longer night or a better fish. My friend Kat, her boyfriend Nick, their friend Megan, and another friend, an unnamed narrator in some of the tellings, decided to push the curfew. They wanted to chase catfish by moonlight, the kind of stupid math young people do, where the risk is part of the thrill. They climbed the rusted chain-link fence at a spot where the wire had been bent for years, ducked through the brush, and came upon a small cove. The canoe sat pulled up on the bank as if someone had paused and meant to return. Inside, someone had left a sandwich half-eaten on a paper towel. A tackle box lay open and unloved. The phone sat on the center bench with the flashlight on, bleeding a narrow cone of white light onto the hull. Whoever had been there had left in a hurry, or maybe they expected to be back in a few minutes. It felt wrong, in that small way that says human business was interrupted. They debated. Kat wanted to take the canoe, or at least to have a look around. Nick argued they should go. Megan wasn't sure. As they stood there, a figure appeared on the far side of the reservoir. At first, it was a silhouette, a dark human shape against the trees. Then the silhouette turned its head in their direction and walked along the bank like someone checking what's going on. He was too far to make out features, but he was deliberate, the kind of movement that says you're watching, not just passing. Then he shouted. It wasn't a friendly hey, it was an angry, guttural call that echoed over the water and seemed to make the little animals stop breathing for a beat. Something in his voice told them he was not merely warning them, but making a claim. Someone else had put a stake in that place and did not like trespassers. After a minute of yelling, he slipped into the water and began to swim across the reservoir toward them. Imagine hearing someone breaking the rules and then deciding to cross the water to confront you. Imagine the sudden clarity that you are outnumbered by a scenario you don't want to debate. They ran. Not a slow-motion cinematic run, a shambling, panicked scramble through the hole in the fence, the scrape of metal against skin, the rust stain on their hands. Gravel skittered under their feet as a car engine somewhere in the dark coughed and died. They didn't stop to take anything with them, not even the half-eaten sandwich. They got to the car and drove away with a fuel can in the trunk and their hearts racing like they had been on the losing end of a bet. Afterward, they wondered who owned that canoe. Was it the man who'd swum after them? Maybe. Maybe he'd been out protecting property. Maybe he'd been drunk. Maybe he had something else on his mind. They didn't know. The phone had been left on, screen bright,
as if someone had been interrupted mid-text. The flashlight was still lit.
Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was code for "don't come back." What stayed with them and with me when they told the story was the feeling of being watched. There's a particular terror in realizing someone has been studying your patterns, knowing the times you come and go. That sense of being expected, of being part of someone else's plan, puts you somewhere small and naive. The friends left with a chill that wasn't entirely fear of the man in the water. It was fear at how ordinary an evening had become charged. A canoe, a sandwich, a flashlight, and how thin the line had been between harmless trespass and something that could have turned ugly. When we put these stories side by side, certain themes stand out. They all happen where we go to get away. They all involve the water being a surface that can both reveal and hide. In each case, curiosity nudged people to do something small, to stay a little later, to reach into the marsh, to cross a fence, and that nudge was enough to put them face to face with something they couldn't neatly explain. There's this idea that outdoorsmen and fishermen are skilled at reading the land, the color of the water, the direction of the wind, the behavior of birds. But these accounts show a different kind of lesson, that sometimes the land reads you back. There's a reciprocity. You think you're alone and in control, but there are other wills in those spaces. Animals, other people, weather, and whatever else you don't have a name for. That knowledge, that humility, is what separates the nervous nights from the ones you sleep through. I don't want to turn all of this into paranoia. For every unsettling story, there are 100 perfect nights where the only disturbances are a jumping bass and a distant train. But if you keep fishing long enough, you collect moments that rearrange how you feel about the water. You get stories that make you call your friends at 2 a.m. to say, "Did you ever notice that the duck sounds change when the moon is low?" And you try to laugh it off, even as you know you're whispering. So let's go back briefly to the unresolved parts, because those are the ones that chase you. In the first story, they called the police. An officer walked the shore. They returned with a parent. There was no body. No one came forward to report a missing woman matching that description in the immediate aftermath. Does that mean she wasn't a person in a way that matters? Not necessarily. It might simply mean she was a person who left, vanished in ways people do. But it also means the memory of that scream hangs without an anchor. You can make plausible hypotheses, but none of them sit comfortably with everything witnessed that night. In Jay and Angel's marsh incident, a knot of possibilities exists. The marsh is full of old man-made detritus and living things that can give you a scare.
But there's a difference between being snagged and being gripped in a way that tries to drag you under. The physical memory, whatever left a smear on Angel's leg, whatever left him shaking, matters because it's visceral and it resists clean explanation. And the reservoir canoe? That one ends on the simple, common note of being watched. If someone had left their gear and phone and intended to come back, why would they swim across to confront a group of kids on the other side? If they were the canoe's owner, why leave it like that at all? If they weren't, what were they doing there? The ambiguity tightens the story until it's almost unbearable. You can imagine the worst and the most banal at the same time. Every time I tell these stories, people ask me what I think. Do I believe in monsters, in ghosts, in creatures that dwell beneath the surface and who prefer the flesh of fishermen? No. I believe in human perception and in how the brain fills gaps with stories to make sense of the strange. I believe in the physical dangers of water, hypothermia, undercurrent, submerged hazards. I believe in the way stress and fear can reshape memory. And I also believe that sometimes there are things that are simply unaccounted for, and that life hands you images and sensations you can't tuck into tidy boxes. Consider how every detail plays into fear. A scream, long and terrible, lodges, not because of its cause, but because of its sound. The feel of mud on skin brings you back to a place where things hold you down. The sight of a flashlight left on in a canoe tells you someone was interrupted. Those are tangible facts. The rest, the sense that something else was present, is a human attempt to stitch a story out of those facts.
What all three of these accounts gave the people involved was a new respect for that edge where normal leisure and sudden danger meet. Some of them changed behaviors after their experiences. JJ and I avoided fishing after dusk for a long time. Angel stopped using his phone in the shallow reeds. Kat, Nick, and Megan took the long way home and chose official public ramps after that night, even if it meant driving an extra 20 minutes. But these stories didn't end with a single decision. They live in the way people talk about the night. They live in the way little rituals pick up a new meaning. When I pass a lake now, and the wind is like a hand across the water, my fingers tighten on the steering wheel. When a friend texts that they're going to hit up the reservoir at midnight, I send a half-joking, half-serious message. Be careful. It's a small thing, but it's the way we show we were listening. I'll leave you with this. Water is a mirror that can also swallow. It gives back what you want and takes what you didn't know you had to lose. It hides motion in calm and calm in motion. For some people, fishing is a place to find peace. For others, it becomes a place where questions live. I still go out. I still cast a line.
But there are spots I won't step near after dark, and there are stories I tell around a fire that make even the bravest among us look down at our hands and notice how steady they are. If you've got your own fishing horror story, something small that turned into a long memory, put it in the comments. Tell us where you were, what you felt, and whether you ever went back. Which of these three creeped you out the most? Vote in the comments below. Thanks for listening. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe, like the video if it gave you chills, and share it with someone who loves camping or fishing late into the night. I'll be back with more true accounts that blur the line between ordinary and the uncanny. Until then, watch the water and listen for the things that make the surface ripple when everything else is still.